The arrival of German child soldiers at Canadian POW camps in 1945 created administrative and moral complications that Canadian authorities hadn't anticipated when planning for prisoner detention and repatriation. These weren't the hardened Wehrmacht veterans or ideological SS troops that comprised most German prisoner populations, but rather boys aged 14 to 17 who had been conscripted into the Volkssturm or Hitler Youth units during the war's desperate final months, who had seen brief and traumatic combat, and who had been captured by Allied forces and processed through the POW system, despite being technically too young for military service under international law. The Geneva Conventions had provisions for handling prisoners of war, but said relatively little about what to do with child combatants who fell into a gray area between soldiers deserving detention and minors requiring protection. The specific incident that would highlight these complications occurred at a POW camp near Lethbridge, Alberta, where approximately 30 German boys had been housed separately from adult prisoners due to their age, and the recognition that mixing them with older, more ideologically committed prisoners might be problematic. These boys had been captured during the final weeks of fighting in Germany, had been shipped to Britain for initial processing, and had then been transferred to Canada as part of the broader distribution of German POWs across camps in North America. Their time in Canadian custody had been marked by better treatment than they had received during their brief military service. Regular meals, medical care, education programs that Canadian authorities had organized specifically for younger prisoners, and generally humane conditions that contrasted sharply with the chaos and violence they had experienced during the war's final collapse. When Germany's surrender made repatriation the pressing question for all German POWs, Canadian authorities assumed that child soldiers would be among the first priorities for return. They were minors, they had families in Germany who presumably wanted them back, and keeping children in detention camps when the war was over seemed both unnecessary and morally problematic. But when camp administrators began processing the younger prisoners for repatriation and explaining that they would be returning to Germany, they encountered unexpected resistance from a significant number of the boys who stated flatly that they didn't want to go back, that they preferred to remain in Canada even if that meant continued detention, and that they feared or didn't want to face what awaited them in defeated Germany. The reasons these boys gave for refusing repatriation were varied and reflected the traumatic circumstances that had brought them into military service and captivity. Some had lost their entire families during the war, parents killed in bombing raids, siblings dead in combat or from disease and malnutrition, homes destroyed leaving nothing to return to. For these boys, Germany meant only devastation and loss, while Canada represented stability and the possibility of a future that didn't involve searching through ruins for non-existent family members. Others came from areas that had been occupied by Soviet forces, and they expressed terror at the prospect of returning to Soviet-controlled territory where they feared harsh treatment or forced labor based on their service in German military units. Several boys had been orphaned even before their military conscription and had no family connections in Germany beyond institutional care that had been disrupted by the war's chaos. But perhaps the most troubling category consisted of boys who had been so thoroughly indoctrinated by Nazi ideology and propaganda that they feared returning to a defeated Germany because they couldn't accept the reality of German defeat and didn't know how to exist in a world where everything they had been taught was revealed as false. These boys had been raised in Hitler Youth programs that had shaped their entire worldview, had been told that Germany's victory was inevitable, and that service to the Führer was the highest calling, and the collapse of that ideological framework left them psychologically adrift in ways that made repatriation feel like returning to a Germany that no longer existed and that they couldn't recognize. For them, remaining in Canada meant avoiding confrontation with a reality they weren't prepared to process. Canadian authorities found themselves in an unusual position, uncertain how to handle minors who were refusing repatriation and who were making claims that couldn't simply be dismissed as attempts to avoid legitimate detention. The boys weren't lying about their family situations. Canadian records confirmed that many had indeed lost parents and siblings, that their home communities had been destroyed, that returning them to Germany meant sending them into circumstances where their welfare couldn't be guaranteed. Yet allowing German POWs, even young ones, to remain in Canada by choice would set precedents that could complicate broader repatriation efforts, and that might encourage other prisoners to manufacture reasons why they too should be allowed to stay. The decision-making process involved multiple Canadian government departments, immigration officials who normally handled admission of foreign nationals, military authorities responsible for POW management, child welfare agencies that became involved once the prisoner's age was considered, and foreign affairs officials concerned about international law and Canada's obligations under Geneva Conventions. The question wasn't simply whether these boys could legally remain in Canada, but whether it was morally right to force minors to return to circumstances that might genuinely endanger their welfare, and whether Canada had obligations to children who had been conscripted into military service by a regime that had now been defeated and whose legal authority no longer existed. The compromise that eventually emerged reflected Canadian attempts to balance competing concerns while avoiding the creation of precedents that might apply more broadly to adult POWs. The boys would be allowed to delay their repatriation while Canadian authorities attempted to verify their family situations and to locate relatives or guardians in Germany who might take responsibility for them. Those who could be reunited with family would be repatriated with support to ensure they reached their relatives safely. But for boys who genuinely had no family and no support network in Germany, Canadian authorities would consider allowing them to remain under guardianship arrangements that would make them wards of the Canadian state rather than POWs awaiting repatriation. The implementation of this policy created its own complications. Verifying family situations in immediate post-war Germany was extraordinarily difficult. Communication systems were disrupted, civil records had been destroyed in bombing raids, population movements had scattered people across different zones of occupation, and the general chaos meant that establishing facts about individual families required months of investigation that left the boys in Canadian detention while their status remained unresolved. Some boys became frustrated with this lengthy process and withdrew their refusal to be repatriated, deciding that whatever awaited them in Germany was preferable to indefinite limbo in Canadian POW camps. Others maintained their position and waited through months of bureaucratic processing while Canadian officials tried to determine their futures. The boys who were ultimately allowed to remain in Canada, approximately 9 out of the original 30 who had refused repatriation, became wards of child welfare authorities and were placed in foster care or institutional settings where they would complete their education and receive support in transitioning to Canadian society. This arrangement was controversial and attracted criticism from various quarters. Some Canadians felt that allowing enemy soldiers, even young ones, to remain in Canada rewarded their service to the Nazi regime and was unfair to Canadian families who had lost sons in the war. Others argued that children conscripted into military service were victims rather than perpetrators, and that Canada had moral obligations to protect them regardless of the circumstances that had made them combatants. The German government, still forming and operating under Allied occupation, had mixed reactions to Canada's decision. Some German officials appreciated that Canada was taking responsibility for children who might otherwise become homeless orphans in Germany's devastated landscape. Others felt that Germany's children belonged in Germany regardless of circumstances, and that allowing them to emigrate to Canada suggested that Germany couldn't care for its own people, a perception that had negative implications for German sovereignty and national pride during the difficult post-war Reconstruction period. For the boys themselves, the transition from child soldiers to Canadian residents was psychologically complex and often traumatic in new ways. They had to learn English, or had to adapt to Canadian culture and institutions that were completely foreign to their experience, had to process the trauma of their wartime experiences while simultaneously building new identities in a country that viewed them with suspicion and sometimes hostility. The foster families and institutions that took responsibility for them faced challenges in dealing with boys who had been trained as soldiers, who carried psychological damage from combat and from their exposure to Nazi ideology, and who struggled with conflicting feelings about their German identity and their new Canadian circumstances. The success of these boys' integration varied considerably. Some adapted remarkably well, completing their education, finding employment, eventually becoming Canadian citizens, and building lives that bore little resemblance to their traumatic adolescence as child soldiers. They learned to speak English without accents, married Canadian women, had children who grew up knowing only that their fathers had come from Germany, but often unaware of the full circumstances that had brought them to Canada. These success stories validated Canadian authorities' decision to allow them to remain, suggesting that children could overcome even severe early trauma if given support and opportunity. Others struggled throughout their lives with the psychological damage their experiences had created, with difficulties forming relationships, with substance abuse problems, with inability to maintain stable employment or to integrate successfully into Canadian society despite the support they received. For these individuals, the decision to remain in Canada rather than returning to Germany may have prevented one set of problems but created others, leaving them culturally and psychologically adrift in ways that no amount of institutional support could fully address. The question of whether they would have been better off returned to Germany remained unanswerable, comparison to a counterfactual that never occurred. The incident became a minor footnote in Canadian immigration and POW history, occasionally mentioned in discussions about child soldiers and about how liberal democracies should handle minors who have been conscripted into armed forces. The boys who remained in Canada generally avoided publicity about their pasts, recognizing that their status as former enemy soldiers, even child soldiers, could create difficulties in communities where the war's memory remained vivid and where German identity carried stigma. Most changed their names, either formally through legal processes or informally by adopting Canadian nicknames and anglicizing their surnames, creating distance between their current identities and their pasts as German military conscripts. The broader implications of allowing these child soldiers to remain in Canada were debated by immigration officials and policymakers for years afterward. Had Canada established a precedent that enemy combatants could avoid repatriation by claiming hardship in their home countries? Should child soldiers be treated as victims deserving protection or as combatants subject to the same rules as adult POWs? What obligations did countries have to children who had been conscripted into military service by regimes that subsequently collapsed, leaving those children effectively stateless or without guardians? These questions had no clear answers, but they would arise again in subsequent conflicts where child soldiers became features of warfare. For the Lethbridge camp where the incident occurred, the presence of the child soldiers and the controversy over their refusal to be repatriated became part of the camp's history, remembered by Canadian guards and administrators who had dealt with the unusual situation. Some camp staff felt that allowing the boys to remain was the right decision and took pride in Canada's willingness to provide refuge to children in difficult circumstances. And others worried that the decision had been driven more by sentimentality about children than by clear thinking about law and policy, and that creating exceptions for sympathetic cases undermined the consistent administration of immigration and repatriation rules. The story of German child soldiers refusing to leave Canada after the war illustrated the complicated moral territory that existed at the intersection of military justice, child welfare, immigration policy, and post-war reconstruction. These boys were simultaneously victims of Nazi Germany's desperate final mobilization, perpetrators who had served in military units that fought against Allied forces, orphans deserving protection, and enemy aliens whose presence in Canada required legal justification. Canadian authorities' decision to allow some to remain represented an attempt to prioritize children's welfare over rigid application of rules, but it also created ambiguities and precedents that complicated how similar situations might be handled in the future.